my great pleasure to welcome Mely Caballero-Anthony for today's seminar. Mely is Professor of International Relations and Head of the Centre for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Professor Anthony has published quite extensively on regionalism and multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific, human security and non-traditional security, conflict prevention and global governance. Her latest single-authored and co-edited books include Negotiating Governance on Non-Traditional Security in Southeast Asia and Beyond, published by Columbia University Press this year, An Introduction to Non-Traditional Security Studies, published by SAGE in London in 2016, and Asia on the Move, published by the Japan Centre for International Exchange in 2015, as well as Human Security and Climate Change, a Routledge publication in 2014. The journal articles are too numerous to mention here, but they are equally as important and interesting. Mely's leadership roles within and beyond academia are also considerable. She is the current Secretary General of the Consortium on Non-Traditional Security Studies in Asia. This is a network of think tanks and research organisations working on non-traditional security issues. Between 2013 and 2017, Professor Anthony was also a member of the UN Security General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters and served as its chairperson in 2016. She was Director of External Relations at the ASEAN Secretariat from 2011 to 2012 and has been a member of the World Economic Forum, Global Agenda Council on Conflict Prevention. From 2015 to 2017, she was Vice President at Large of the Governing Council of the Professional Academic International Studies Association and is currently a member of its Global South Task Force. In addition, Professor Anthony has led global and regional research projects, including in 2017 when she co-chaired the Global Reflection Group on the Monopoly of the Use of Force 2.0, which brought together 21 scholars from Asia, Africa, Europe and the Americas that examined the nature of security provision in times of uncertainty, a topic she will address today. She was also the principal investigator of the MacArthur Asia Security Initiative project of international security challenges in Asia and cross-border implications. Our university has also capitalised on Professor Anthony's expertise in the past. She was co-chair of the Murdoch Commission on Food Security, Trade and Partnership in Asia, which reported its findings in this publication in 2015, some copies of which we have in Sia's hands over there. You can get a copy before you go out if you're interested. So it is indeed a great pleasure to renew Mely's connection today with Murdoch University through her presentation for the Asia Research Centre's Australia-Asia Engagement Public Seminar Series on her topic, Providing Security in Times of Uncertainty. Welcome back to Murdoch, Mely, and over to you for a 45-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. When people ask to send a CD, I don't expect you to read it. But anyways, thanks very much for the generous introduction. I'm more than delighted to come back to Murdoch. The last time I was here was, what, 3-4 years ago? And so it's wonderful to touch base and also to see old friends here. In the time allotted to me, I have a lot of slides, but I just want to tell you that I'll skip through some because, you're so eager to tell a different audience about your work, so you tend to cramp everything. But, my former head of department is here, so I have to be such a small world. So, when you're doing your PhD presentation, they always want you to keep it short. So I'll try my best to keep it short, and maybe if you have any questions, we'll leave it to the Q&A, right? So let me start my presentation. So started. Okay. I think when we talk about the state of global security, one would naturally say, or it's almost like a common thing to talk about global insecurity as almost the hallmark of our times. I have a quote from the Secretary General in early this year when he talks about a dangerous world. And if I really follow much of the work of the UN when they talk about flagging security issues, I go back to Kofi Annan's in larger freedom, when he already flagged many of these issues that we have that's confronting the international community. In one of the recent works that I've co-chaired together with the Bonn International Center for Conversion, we looked at the extent to which the state, through its legitimate monopoly of the use of force, is able to deal with the many challenges that we have. And you can look at this publication in the FES website, but there's basically, in spite of whatever you say about the role of the state and the main findings of this study that went on for 2 years and had many participants in it from various regions, Africa, Latin America, is that while the state is really challenged in multiple fronts as to what it can do, it remains the unit of analysis and the main focal point for international works in global security, but that at the very end of it, what we should really aim is a more, what they call, network world. That is not new to those of you who study governance. But my main argument for today's presentation is that when we look at approaches to deal with multiple security challenges, depending on how you define security, in East Asia, where most of you who study politics would say, we are very much confined to or restricted by norms of non-interference, etc., especially when you have countries of different political orientation, we do actually have a mosaic, I call it mosaic forms of arrangements that provides security in times of uncertainty. That's essentially the main argument of this presentation. But on why do we have this state of security and uncertainty? Our previous study talked about two contending forces. One is really globalization, which I don't have to say, explain what it is, but essentially with all the rapid advancement in technology, Rosenau talked about localization, really the how do you say, reduction of spaces, etc. You're looking at transnationalization of many issues, including transnational threats, right? Global terrorism, for those of you that study traditional forms of security, networks, and multiple, especially now, the multifaceted threats that's coming from climate. Just like, when there's one force, Newtonian rule of, when there's something, then there's a reaction. An opposite to globalization is really fragmentation. And this, I believe, is the one that causes all this insecurity. And, I'll put it there on the board. It's really fueled by the rapid changes in technology, but also it also generates a lot of insecurity, including cyber insecurity, loss of community identity, growing disparities in wealth. I mean, there's a huge study of that, and I believe this Asia Research Center is also working on these issues. And that, in a way, fuels identity politics, or politics that tears apart even newly independent polities, this proliferation of all sorts of information, and I think more importantly, it's really the erosion of trust in institutions. So what is so non-traditional about security challenges nowadays? Well, from my perspective, and those of us who work on the field of non-traditional security, it's really the transnationalization of this impact, of these issues, right? But also the threats, unlike what we understand it from the more realist traditional perspective, is not just man-made, right? But also triggered by rapid changing climate and also advances in technology. And the impact of these threats are most often difficult to reverse, especially when you look at climate change. And also that the coverage, if we talk about the reach and the extent of the threats, is really quite severe. When you talk about just the impact of infectious diseases, at one point, when we had SARS in 2003, the low probability, high impact, they were talking about maybe a repeat of the Spanish flu, 50 million deaths or so. That always is in the mind of people that look at public health, especially with Ebola and all sorts of emerging diseases. And for communities that don't have the capacity to deal with this, the ability to resolve these issues is really minimal. And if you study politics, it's now often difficult to differentiate what is high politics and what is low politics, right? Because as many of my colleagues in the developmental field will say, well, you know, you're securitizing development issues. But I think there is an argument for securitizing them. Communities have securitized them. Different parts of government agencies or international communities have securitized them for a reason, but more importantly, that the capacity of states have really fully stretched. So this is just a definition of non-traditional security. It's really the fact that they're non-military in nature, but they can be equally severe. They have transnational impact, but I guess what we have focused on, at least in the last few years that we have dealt with this, is the ability or the capacity of the international, regional, to deal with these issues, which requires different kind of approach, right? And this approach really is what makes it different from the traditional approaches to what we call traditional security challenges. Let me skip that. I talked about they're no longer soft security challenges. And the reason why we say they're not soft, you know, just like when we say, you know, I come from NTU, Nanyang Technological University, and we just last week, just as an aside, we had this big President's State of the Union address, and because we are nested in a school of technology, he was all talking about, you know, the advances, et cetera, and in the social sciences, we're always seen as the soft sciences. But what is really soft, right? I mean, we would argue we're not soft, we matter. And if you look at this list of risk, and if you just go by some of the modern literature that we have on information of risk, you know, I'm not sure whether you can see it, but in the latest global risk report of WEF, you know, things like natural resource, extreme climate weather, you know, failure of ability to deal with climate change are now high risk, very much in the agenda of the global community. So the question then, as far as providing security, is what is the state of human insecurity in Asia? And when I say Asia, I like to bound that into mostly Southeast Asia, but of course when you talk about frameworks to deal with it, it's East Asia and beyond, right? And so in the next slides that follow, it just tells you why they are not soft security issues and why is it very important to deal with these issues. Top of my list is, of course, the impact of climate change. Every year in the center that I lead in RSIS, we have this what we call year in review, right? And our website, which is basically the repository, we try to make it a repository of NTS research, has what we call fast facts. It's like short information that you know, crammed into one page, just to tell our readers or those that are interested in the impact of climate change in Southeast Asia where it is, right? So we have a lot of information there, but essentially, if you look at the state of climate change and what causes it and the difficulties in trying to manage you know, the impact of climate change, even down to reduction of gas emissions, is that it's very problematic because Southeast Asia is really, especially countries in Southeast Asia and Asia are the biggest emitters of climate change. Our forest sinks are of course also are thinning. And when you talk at the impact of climate change in many ways, whether it is in extreme weather events, unfortunately it's also the most affected, right? So for those who don't follow the climate change debates, and if you want to simplify it, we always talk about climate change in terms of just what, you know, hitting a planet, and there's too much water because of rapid sea level rise, and there's also, on the one hand, there's very little water. And when you talk about really, there's just too much of the natural disasters as a result of, you know, sea level rise, I'm not sure if you can see this, but Asia really is not there. You know, in Southeast Asia, as far as extreme weather events is concerned, we always look at Southeast Asia or some parts of Asia as the supermarket of natural disasters. Right? You name it, we have it. I'm sorry. You talk about tsunamis, storms, cyclones. It's almost every year. And if you're from China, actually, if you tune into television, it's almost every day there's a disaster one way or another as a result of. But the displacement that it causes is staggering. You talk about what happened in Aceh in 2004. You're talking about at least recorded 250,000 missing persons, affected persons. 2008, you had Cyclone Nargis. It went up to 2 million. 2013, you had Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. And if you add it up, and if you're from, you look at the records of displacement, you're looking at least in the region, from 250 to 2 million to 4 million, right, affected communities. I think the latest count that I saw for 2016 from UNESCAP, just in terms of numbers for 2016, globally, there's already, just from extreme weather events, you talk about 36 million for that year, and economic damage to about 77 million. If you're an economist, when you talk about the threat to economic security, right, or if you are just an ordinary individual, you know, communities that are trying to grapple with the impact of this extreme weather events, you know, you could just be one of the numbers, but when you think about it, I mean, I don't need to underscore, you know, why it is such an important issue. But when you don't have enough water too, there is a scholar in South Asia, Brahma Chalani, that talks about, you know, many, in the region, is the Asian region, there's going to be water stress as a result of a warming planet. And when countries, big countries, are experiencing water stress, right, then it triggers, you know, if once upon a time shared water resources can be managed, right, it could trigger increased tension. And in fact, he's argued that the wars in the 21st century is not going to be on territories, but on water. It's the famous publication on water wars. And especially because in that part of the world, particularly South Asia, and closer to, you know, India, Pakistan, China, right, they are also nuclear powers. So when you talk about, you know, all this extrapolation that you can talk, if you want to push the envelope as to why this is an important issue, then you can basically add on. But from a human security perspective, you know, there's also the impact really on food security. And in fact, the study that we have talked about here, if I could flag this, right, really went through this whole gamut of what happens in light of climate change. And I think there's annually the IFRI, the Institute of Food Research, International Food Research Institute, comes up with this study, and it basically talks about the impact of less water on, you know, your crops, either to your fisheries and to your forestry. So, but against all these numbers is also the reality that, you know, when you talk about Asia, right, more than half of the people that are considered hungry or don't have enough food are actually found in Asia. And if you're talking about increase of population by the year 2050, which will basically be in urban areas, 47 of that will also be in Asia. And if you look at what happened back in terms of the instability that it causes, you know, we have this saying, a hungry man is an angry man, and it actually caused riots, right? And you have incidents of that in parts of the Philippines when you had the rapid, the sudden spike in rice prices. But if again, when you talk about numbers, right, where do most of the hungry people live? Again, it's Asia, and most of that, South Asia, you have China, and then you have Southeast Asia, in spite of, you know, very impressive economic growth, for example. I mean, you go to places in China, and most recently in one of the projects with the Griffith Asia Institute, we went to this small place in China, in Xiamen, and coming from Singapore, I thought, well, Singapore infrastructure is good, but in that part of China, it's the third smallest cities, but it's really amazing. So the point being that in spite of impressive economic growth, a lot of hungry people actually live in that part of the world. I just want to go through. So that's food security. I mean, so climate change is a threat multiplier, particularly because communities that are already facing fragilities, and when the impact of climate change hits them, then that vulnerability is also amplified many times over, and the ability to be resilient and to address these issues is also very much reduced. So there is now, in fact, as we are speaking, an initiative by some countries in Europe. It started with Sweden and now Germany when it takes over the chairmanship of the Security Council, to have a unit within the United Nations to just focus on climate insecurity. Because if you talk about the multiple insecurities caused by climate change, who do you go to? There are multiple agencies. But which unit actually tries to coordinate and make sense of all the science that's all around us, and at the same time point to perhaps the more adequate or suitable measures to deal with different types of climate insecurities, right? And let me just go through quickly. And one of the impact of climate change, and if you link it to, one of the facets of non-traditional community is really its cross-sectionality, right? Is when there is massive displacement, it also generates a number of problems. One is, of course, the increase in migration. We see that it's migration, movements of people is not just caused by conflict, it's also caused by natural disasters, right? Because you are economically and physically displaced. But if you look at movements of people, there are different ways to study movements of people. And if you just look at human trafficking, right? That's an irregular, this is considered as irregular migration, right? Or illegal migration, if you don't want to be politically correct. There are now studies in Southeast Asia that shows that, in fact, those people that have been displaced, particularly children and women, are also increasingly vulnerable to human trafficking, right? And why is human trafficking, the worst scourge, so to speak, of humanity that has hit us and coming in different manifestations? It's because when you talk about the dollars and cents of human trafficking, you're talking about, what, 150 billion a year, right? And most of the numbers, when you talk about human trafficking in Asia Pacific, at any given point, we have about 25 million, right, that so far have been reported trafficked, right? But when I talked about the displaced population in 2017, the US Human Trafficking Report actually cited, it was somewhere that when you look at the plight of the Rohingyas, for example, that have been displaced, right? There was a recorded 5,000 people that were actually trafficked, yeah? And when Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines, there were also, I think, about 6,000 people, different forms, were suspected to have been trafficked. And trafficking, right, is there. Why? Because it's for three purposes, as many studies of what is human trafficking for is, of course, for sexual exploitation. The second is, of course, for organ transplant, yeah, and the third is forced labor. So there are many things, and it's aggravated because of massive displacement. Human trafficking is, of course, if you're looking at it from the perspective of transnational crime, is also associated with drug trafficking, right? It's also associated with, all sorts of, even small arms trafficking, etc. So, but again, if you look at it from the human security perspective, who are the victims, essentially? Women, the genderization of human trafficking, it's quite appalling when you look at these numbers, and also the increasingly the impact of human trafficking, the victims of human trafficking, and yet children. And in Southeast Asia, there are certain countries, when it comes to pornography, for example, of children, there are certain countries in Southeast Asia, and because this is being recorded, I will identify them, that are the #1 producers of child pornography, and these are trafficked victims, right? And of course, you have pandemics, etc. I don't have to talk about pandemics because I think it causes so many things. Now, the implications of many of these threats is the proliferation of this is really as I said, the challenge on the capacity of states to deal with, and of course, to to ensure security. If the traditional notion of the security sector, the task is actually to protect the state, its sovereignty from external influence and external attack, the onslaught of many of these transnational security challenges affects or questions the ability of the state. There is therefore a compelling case for, if you're looking at it from the perspective of regionalism, multilateral security cooperation or multilateral development cooperation. But one would also argue it's not just limited to state actors, but also the participation and involvement of multiple actors, right? When I was writing my book on negotiating governance, I've been inspired by the work of 3 women. It's entitled Who Governs the World, written by Susan Sell, Deborah Avant, and Martha Finnemore. When they look at, when you try to sort of open yourself to the participation or the role of other actors in global governance, which they call governors, it's really interesting that you can actually, if you want to, identify certain actors that have been part and parcel of the dynamic changes in global governance, right? And the book, of course, talked about the role of multilateral, like the IMF, and the role of the ICRC. But I thought, when I read that book, I said, well, in my part of the world, I can also identify governors, but they are, in fact, for all intents and purposes, security governors. Why? Because they are, through their work, right, and through their engagement, in themselves involved in the provision of security. And how do you provide security, really, apart from making sure that laws and regulations are being followed? When you look at a slew of non-traditional security challenges, from the perspective of people that are affected by infectious diseases, and when I then try to document many of this and looking at the role of different actors, it's really quite amazing what information you can get. And if you really want to put a theoretical or conceptual description of what they do and how they analyze their engagement with whether it's state-led frameworks, etc., it's amazing what you can actually find, right? So, and how do they actually deal with these issues? I'm going to, how much time do I have? How much time? About 10 minutes? Yeah, okay.
15 minutes actually.
Yeah, right, so, but before that, before you look at the other actors, so to speak, so many people talk about resilience, right? If you're doing research in Singapore, anything with resilience, you can get a research grant. Yeah, especially when you talk about resilience, the cybersecurity, etc. But many often, when you talk about resilience, it's not just the ability to adapt, but how they're able to adapt and who can help people adapt, really. So it's not just understanding what it is, but looking at the different institutions that are involved, the ability, not just of governments, but even communities or societies that are exposed to these threats, to actually be, first is to be able to deal with them, right? And to a certain extent, to maintain the sense of community, so to speak. And this is where I think the contribution of other actors can be best appreciated. On the one hand, you can be cynical and say, at the end of the day, it's the government, right, that makes all these regulations. Yes, but how they come up, how they're able to come up with these regulations, the kind of tensions that have to be worked through, the negotiations, it's because it's not just government agencies that are involved, and it's really more about navigating many of the sensitive topics that come along with dealing with these issues, and I come to that very, very shortly. But I also wanted to again underscore the importance of looking at governance or security provision in another way. And if you look at one of the more popular books that was published and was talked about in 2017, it's by Richard Haas. He talked about a world in disarray. And what was Richard Haas' main argument? He was basically saying that we need a world system 2.0, where he's saying that while states take sovereign responsibility of what's happening within their own territory, within their own borders, and take ownership of the impact of that outside, he also underscored the participation of other actors. Right? I mean, I've met Richard Haas in many forums, and I was really surprised when he came up with, when he talked about the role of other actors. Yeah? So, so this is what I talked about. This is the book that I'm going to, where I thought these are some of my findings. It's essentially that, as I said, if you look at then how communities and different actors, whether different types of civil society organizations, have responded to a slew of non-traditional security challenges, what we have is what I call a mosaic for security arrangements. Why? Because there are different types of actors in different capacity, in different sizes, and that are now increasingly being harnessed to what we call a framework of norms and regulations that hopes to have an inclusive and accountable security. Right? But this requires for them, for many of these actors, to be more open to a different sense of what security challenge is, that it's not just only about the protection of the state from external attacks, or it's not only about trying to fend off counterterrorism or cybersecurity, but to sensitize them about the range of non-traditional security challenge out there. And with a proliferation of these actors, you could perhaps think about or envision a different kind of security architecture that not only focuses on state frameworks in Southeast Asia, in East Asia. We have many of the security frameworks. I just think about in Southeast Asia, we have what we call ASEAN-led frameworks from all the different alphabetical things, from ASEAN, ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6, and many others, right? But frameworks that also involves other existing arrangements that are either sponsored or generated or initiated by different actors. And so I have this what I call a different kind of, it's not new, but I thought this is a different way. I thought of see how this network or mosaic form of security provision can be done. And who you are actually involved in. On the right side of the quadrant, we're talking about all the different things that are. So if I actually list many of the frameworks that have been initiated or by many of these intergovernmental mechanisms, right, like the ASEAN and the other 3 countries, the defense community like the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting, right, and the ASEAN Regional Forum, you do have many of these initiatives that try to address the capacity problem of states and would then also underscore the argument that there is in fact some form of security governance that's taking place in the region. Yeah? And you have these informal arrangements that is also happening, whether it is at the ASEAN level. I did include all the other. When you talk about dealing with, for example, the threat of infectious diseases. Yeah. In Southeast Asia, some of these NGOs that are found, for example, in a country like Indonesia, their structure in dealing with infectious diseases almost mirrors that of their own Ministry of Health. It's really amazing the kind of work that they're doing. And when it comes to trying to stem the flow of infectious diseases, whether it is from SARS or H5N1, governments turn to them because these NGOs, like this big religious body called Muhammadiyah, is very much in touch with their own community. So many of the information campaign, many of the science is then filtered through the civil society groups, and they themselves, help or educate local communities on basic health habits, which, if it is not managed, can actually become issues of national and international security. Right? Even down to how do you treat your sick fawns, for example, your sick chickens, so that you don't, when they are infected, you don't clean them up and send them to the market and sell them, right? Because you're telling them that this is important. Or in China, right? Why is it they regard to just simply wash your hands and you don't have to, you don the mask, but it's really more important to have basic health habits. Because if you don't, then you're talking about millions of people that could be infected should there be an outbreak of pandemic influenza. So that is just one. When it comes to, for example, dealing with the impact of displaced population, even down to refugees, right, or traffic victims, you can actually find evidence of certain, I would say, influential to a certain extent because of their, what they call knowledge, expertise, their network with or engagement or closeness to some of these regional bodies, and how they're participating in the regional debates now as to how to deal with them. A good example is what do you do with the displaced population in the Rakhine state? Yeah. For the longest time, in the attempt to make the region more prepared with natural disasters and to keep the region more safe, at the more formal level, they're not looking at having an agreement. People are, they don't like agreements because it affects sovereignty, etc. But when you talk about disaster risk reduction, right, one of the, in fact, the only document following the Hugo framework is the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Preparedness, which is ADMIR, which was signed in 2009 and eventually led to the establishment of the ASEAN Humanitarian Center for management of natural disasters, the AHA Center. So there's a lot of conversation about, when something happens, how do you get states to cooperate, make sure that the military is, you have this initial arrangement with militaries to come on board. You don't have to worry about, other countries coming in because you're worried about your national security. How do you manage technology coming in? There's a lot of discussion on that. But there's also a pressure now to don't just work on natural disasters, but also on different types of emergencies, complex emergencies like what happens in the Rakhine. So months after the August 2017 crisis, Rakhine crisis, when you had all these massive people fleeing the Rakhine state, there was pressure within the ASEAN Secretariat coming from different civil society groups. One of those is the Asia-Pacific Network on Refugees, to say, surely you can expand the remit of what you're supposed to do to be involved, to get yourselves involved with the treatment of displaced population. It was a big debate. The debate is still continuing, just as of September, right? In August last month, we had this big do in Singapore, strategic planning, disaster management, etc. And interestingly, the communities, the bureaucrats that are in charge of disaster management are sharing that they themselves, in their own national domains, are being pressured to expand the remit of ADMIR to really deal with complex emergencies. So the long and short of, it's not ideal, but they were able to, at least this small unit within ASEAN and together with the help of other communities, Médecins Sans Frontières, and what they call it the humanitarian group, different societies that come and help in natural disasters, to convince the government of Myanmar to allow them to deliver, humanitarian goods to the affected community, to the Rakhine state. Some civil society groups weren't happy because they didn't do more than that was all they could do, and they had to settle with the fact that they can only deliver the goods, but they're not allowed to distribute. Right? But if you think just by that example, is that security provision in times of uncertainty? One could argue, of course it is. Because if, for example, if you contrast it to what happened in 2008, when there was this cyclone Nargis, and because of the refusal of the Myanmar government to allow international help to come in, and those who studied the crisis were saying that the government was not just guilty of not allowing international help to come in, but guilty of neglect, So if you are a fan of the responsibility to protect, that is considered crimes of humanity, then fast forward to 2017 or 2018, then you're saying the international community, through engagement of other actors, have in a way intervened perhaps in a very small, very small part, but at least there are multiple affected communities, those that have gone out and those who have been left behind, right? The fact that there is now pressure to open up, to assist, to accept help, right, through these regional frameworks and with engagement of multiple actors can be, I believe, a good example to say that there is movement that's happening that's in a way challenging existing norms, right? It may not be able to change it, but provides a very good example of the dynamics of security governance that's actually evolving in the region, right? So when I talk about negotiating governance, security governance in East Asia, from the perspective of non-traditional security threats, then you actually have what I call this myriad forms of regional arrangements that are there to then argue that if the impression of East Asia is one that, where countries are unwilling to cooperate because of territorial disputes and because of the power of and the influence of China, etc., you actually can find, right, a significant pattern of governance that involves multiple actors, right, that in a way protects and provides security for even those that may have been marginalized, right? So I think I'll stop here and we can continue this conversation if you have more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.